Okay, it's 12 o'clock, so I'm just gonna get started. Anyone else who's ready to come in, I'll let them in as they come. Welcome to the American Bar Association Construction Law Forum's Toolbox Talk series. This is put on by Division 1, and this is our last Toolbox Talk series for 2024. Today, we have two guests discussing tips from the trenches using the mediator's proposal to your best advantage. Our speakers today are Matthew Argue and Jean Witkin. They're both AMCC arbitrators and longtime construction law practitioners. A little bit about each. Jean Witkin is passionate about helping businesses.
Think she froze up.
Yeah. Anita, we can't hear you. Well, maybe, so, Jean and Matt, maybe if, you want to just take 30 seconds and introduce yourself, and then we can go ahead and get started.
Sure, I'll go first. I'm going to keep, since it's my, but no one likes talking about their own bio. I do mediation and other forms of alternative dispute resolution for all kinds of cases, in particular construction cases, both commercial and residential. Matt?
Yeah, good morning. I've been doing construction litigation for my entire career for 35 years, and for the last 19 years, full-time mediator, arbitrator, discovery referee, all focused on construction and insurance. And fun fact, Jean and I met 26 years ago in a case that went to the California Supreme Court that we were on the opposite side of and had a great relationship ever since. So it's fun to be here today with him.
Those are the best friendships. So, Kanita, we lost you for a second, so they just introduced themselves, and I think they can probably go ahead and get started.
Yeah.
All right, well, thank you, everybody, and I appreciate people being here so close to the holidays. I know everyone's busy this time of year, and it's a privilege to be on with my friend and longtime colleague, former litigation opponent, Matt. Before we get into the tips, just to make sure there's no misunderstanding, what is a mediator's proposal? Mediator's proposal is a proposal made by the neutral when the traditional back and forth negotiations have stalled out. So I'd call it an end game tool in the toolbox. And it's often when one party's threatening to leave, when there's a couple lines in the sand that are not intersecting, when a lawyer's reluctant to state a bottom line, or occasionally when a party's not trusting their counsel to give them a good evaluation of where the case can end up. At that time, the neutral is frequently asked to make their own settlement proposal, and we're reluctant to do that unless there's a high probability of success. So what a mediator's proposal is not, it's not a shortcut, and it's not just to split the difference. It's a tool we use at the end of the case after we've gathered extensive information, some public, some confidential, to help close the gap. Matt, anything else on that before I go into tips?
Yeah, definitely looking forward to talking today about this, tool that we use that is very powerful tool, but it's powerful because it's used in the right way at the right time. So just want to emphasize this is not something that happens in every single case. We're going to really go through what we think makes it very effective. And, most importantly, the mediator proposal is an independent, proposal from the mediator, and we'll explain that in further detail. Jean, back to you.
Okay, so tips for making it successful. Sufficient information. I typically start gathering information pre-mediation. And this could include getting some private concerns that are not in the mediation brief, such as, are there timing issues? Is there a pending summary judgment? Are there funding issues? Will one party be more willing to resolve if they can get it done quickly so that they could get it funded? Or conversely, another party really wants to push it into the next fiscal year. Also, I try to gather pre-mediation driving objectives. For example, especially in the case of construction mediations, is one or the other party concerned about precedent? Are there 5 similarly situated cases where they're afraid this case will be used as a floor or a ceiling? That can impact how the negotiations go, and also where I need to go if I'm called upon to do a mediator's proposal. Next, third parties. Are there any empty chairs that might make settlement difficult, that might get us close, but we can't close it without getting another party there? That's helpful to get right up front. And the last thing I try to do before the mediation even starts is explore coverage ramifications. Is there a limits problem? Is there a missing carrier? We frequently find out during the mediation that there was another policy on the risk. It's helpful to get that up front to make sure the mediation proceeds smoothly. And if I'm called upon to make a mediator's proposal, if I've got all the information and all the parties necessary for success. Matt, anything else on pre-mediation?
I'll move into, during the mediation. So most importantly, during the mediation, the parties themselves need to really fully negotiate the case and try to resolve the case. Occasionally I'll come a case where the parties are staying at, very polar opposite positions. And I will suspect, and sometimes I'll even be told, well, we're just waiting for a mediator's proposal at the end. And I really discourage that strongly. That's not a recipe for it to be successful at the end if the parties are not negotiating. A mediator's proposal generally bridges the gap when the parties themselves have gotten as far as they could in negotiations. They're at essentially an impasse, but they still want to resolve the case and they're looking for an independent evaluation of that. Most importantly to the mediator proposal is to really understand the strengths and weaknesses of the case. For the parties themselves to understand each other's positions. For the mediator in particular, I spent a lot of time pre-mediation, during mediation, reading all the briefs and the expert information to fully understand the case. And that's one of the comments I frequently hear on the cases as well. You've really gone into the details and understand, the ins and outs of the case. Sometimes that means the experts themselves need to spend time together in a joint expert meeting. And I'd say in virtually every case, the experts typically before the mediation, meet months in advance to talk about their positions and most importantly, to compromise their positions. I always tell the experts that when we're in a mediation context, their job is to try to help us get to resolution. If they get to the arbitration or the trial, they can, talk about their maximum positions. But really trying to get the parties as close as they can. And along with that is testing the waters on the settlement ranges. A lot of times this happens in a private caucus where the mediator is meeting separately with the parties and or the experts. All those private caucus meetings are confidential. None of that information is shared with the other side unless we agree, the mediator and the parties agree that we're going to share some of that information. But generally the mediators, hearing the parties, positions, sometimes parties are very candid about where they, their ultimate settlement positions are. And as a mediator, I hold that very closely. My personal view is the more information you share with the mediator, the better the mediator can, do in resolving the case for the benefit of each side. Sometimes the parties do the opposite. They hold it very close to the vest and, the mediator really never knows till the very end of the case, what the settlement value is. But all along the way, the mediator is, listening to the parties, evaluating, determining where the case can potentially settle, hearing both sides. Obviously, that's information, you never hear if you're not, in all of the rooms. And that's one of the fun parts of being the mediator, is being able to be in all those rooms. Also, one technique is bracketing. And bracketing, I would say, some people feel strongly for or against it. Bracketing is a way to get the parties into the range of settlement. As a mediator, offers that are outside of the zone of settlement, either too high or too low, really don't move the ball forward to resolving the case. There's generally a settlement range. We may have differences of opinion as to what the settlement range is, but just as an example, let's say one party's, making demands above $5 million, and one party's making offers, below $100,000. Well, those parties are not in the range for settlement, and we can have discussions about what that settlement range is. But let's say generally, at some point in the case, towards the end of the case, I have a feeling that this case is going to settle somewhere between $1 million and $2 million. It's just a broad example. And I would suggest to the parties, I don't think this case is going to settle if we're not at least in this range, and we've got to figure out a way to get there. And sometimes bracketing is a way to do that. Gene, do you have anything else during the mediation process?
Yeah, let me just touch on one bullet point that's in the slide, the joint experts. I found that to be an extremely useful tool, especially in construction, and especially if the experts are in the same jurisdiction. A lot of these folks know each other. They have a good relationship. They've had multiple cases before. And if you pull in the experts for a private caucus, either during the mediation or hopefully prior to the mediation, often there's a candid discussion. They might even tell you, hey, we agree with the other side on, we got our litigation position, but yeah, the other guy's point is not wrong. And frequently, especially in construction cases, we're able to move much closer to center with those joint expert meetings. Matt, can we go to the next slide?
Absolutely. Breakout sessions. How do you use those, Gene, for a mediator's proposal?
Okay, so breakout sessions is one of my favorite tools. I typically pull the counsel out, maybe not at the start, but fairly early on. And one of the reasons is to find out how entrenched one or other party is. A lot of times they think, well, they're just posturing, and then they hear directly from opposing counsel, no, we're really not. This client is concerned about, say, precedent, or this client really has a problem because of insurance. It also might give each party a candid peek behind the curtain at where the other party is. For example, one thing that happens with some frequency is one or other of the parties is focused completely on one issue, and that's not really the driving issue for the other side. So a tip from the trenches is let them hear what's driving it in your room. For example, we have some where they're focused entirely on damages. And then I get the counsel out together in a breakout session. They said, hey, we're not really that far apart on damages. Our issue is causation. Can you give us some more on causation? And that'll help move my client towards the middle. I'll also sometimes take out counsel one at a time. This is really I'd call it take their temperature, find out, is their client giving them a drop dead number, which I really don't like. And more importantly, can we get into a range? Can we get somewhere where, in say a Venn diagram, the two parties' acceptable settlement ranges, depending on other settlement factors, can overlap. Third thing I'll do in the breakout sessions is talk to insurance reps. Especially for young practitioners, one tip from the trenches is give some attention to the insurance folks who are there. Sometimes they're ignored in these sessions. I pull them out, talk to them privately, make sure I know what their concerns is. Maybe there's an issue of inadequate limits. Maybe they have a concern that they've just found out there's another carrier who should be contributing. And sometimes even they'll surprise me and say, hey, I've got more money than my panel counsel even knows. On the other side of the insurance breakout is the personal counsel. And that's helpful to find out, are there coverage issues that can stall settlement, or are there funding issues? And if you get those sorted out, it'll either help you expedite getting towards traditional settlement, or if I'm called upon to make a mediator's proposal, more likely that it'll be accepted. Matt, anything else on breakouts?
I agree with you. I think breakout sessions are very helpful. They can be, just a couple of minutes sometimes. And in my mind, I think of them as kind of a shortcut, frankly. Sometimes we can have a very quick conversation, candid and to the point. And, the parties generally are just fine with it, even though you're taking someone out of the room and having a private conversation. Generally, I think, they understand it's part of the process and not a problem at all. Related to that is the idea of joint sessions. Now, joint sessions, again, is another tool that I think people have strong opinions about. And sometimes I think people think joint sessions are, at the beginning of a mediation where the mediator brings everybody together, maybe has some preliminary remarks and has parties, talking directly to each other, kind of like an opening session. And I'm going to say that's not what I'm talking about in terms of a joint session. For me, joint sessions generally occur, towards the middle, towards the end of the mediation. And I've listened to both sides. I've heard their strengths of their cases, their impassioned arguments. And what I'm looking for is, sometimes counsel, sometimes experts, and sometimes even claims adjusters that just have the ability to talk across the table to the other side. I've seen this done extremely, effectively. If a party can acknowledge the other side, even acknowledge some of the, the points of their case, and then really explain where the limits are. It could be sometimes limits of coverage, could be sometimes, differences in, repair methods or methodologies, But I've seen, counsel in one particular case, say to a homeowner on a very high expensive home, we understand that there are real problems with your house that need to be fixed, and we're here to pay for that. But we also have other limitations, both with our carrier, with our experts, and just being able to make that personal connection made a huge difference in getting that case resolved. Also, joint sessions can be used to confirm some areas where the parties haven't agreed and really focus in on what are the actual, issues in dispute. Also it's an opportunity for the parties to hear the other side, sometimes counsel, sometimes the parties directly, and really assess the strengths and the weaknesses of the case. Even though the mediator can convey the exact same information, maybe even use the exact same words, when you're hearing it from counsel or from parties directly, and you hear their resolve, or frankly, their lack of, convincing proof, either way, it really helps the parties to come together. It's kind of like a final risk analysis where the parties are really evaluating the pros and cons of settling the case. And that kind of, as the mediator, I'm listening to all that myself, and that will factor into my final, analysis and evaluation of the case. And then lastly, and very importantly, is, mediation is the opportunity for the parties to have complete control of this dispute. I mean, remember, once the case gets out of mediation, goes to either an arbitrator or a jury or a judge, it's in somebody else's hands. And how many times have you had a case where, it was decided by one of those other third parties, and they picked up on things that, frankly, you were never even thinking about, or even opposing counsel were thinking about, that were instrumental in their decision making. In other words, you just don't know. You don't know what other people are going to do. In the mediation, you have complete control of that outcome, and you have relationships. I mean, most of these cases involve, construction as a relational business, and these parties had strong relationships, even sometimes personal relationships that have gotten fractured. And mediation, allows you to leverage that, but it also allows sometimes those relationships to come back together. And one of the things that can happen in mediation is it can actually be a springboard to future relationships and future opportunities. Gene, do you have anything else on joint sessions?
Yeah, let me just tag on. I think that leverage relationships point is extremely important. A lot of times there'll be multiple contracts with the same prime contractor and sub, or say a design professional. And so it's helpful for them to mend a bridge without litigation, without publicity, so they can go on and have more successful endeavors together. So let's say we've gone through the pre-mediation, we've done the breakouts, we've done the joint sessions, but the parties are still a ways apart. So we're kind of at the end game. Matt, can we get the next slide?
So we're at the end of mediation.
Yeah, so what to do when the negotiations stall out? Matt, when and how should mediators step in and to expedite settlement?
So we're really now at the stage where we're, at the resolution point of the case, and we're going to assume that all the things we've talked about up to this point have been done, and it's the appropriate time to really start thinking about a mediator's proposal. So in other words, the parties have negotiated fully. They haven't, come to a resolution, and they're both asking, frankly, for the mediator to come in and step in and offer a proposal. That's the first thing, is that both sides really need to ask for that, which when they ask for that, what they're intending, what the mediator is interpreting, is both sides are willing to compromise further. Neither side has stopped in their ability to resolve the case, and they're willing to hear a number that, frankly, neither side has offered, maybe even thought about, but they're willing to let the neutral party come in. And sometimes that's the crucial step in the case. The parties and or claims adjusters or others, decision makers, may just need a neutral party to come in and make that decision for them. Importantly, we're not talking about splitting the baby. I can't even think of a case that I've ever had where I had two parties apart and split the baby and said, here's the proposal. The mediator proposal is most fundamentally an independent evaluation of the case. It's not an evaluation of what's going to happen at a trial or an arbitration. At the ultimate, because that's not the mediator's role. They're not in that role. But what they are in the role of, having heard both sides, they understand what each side may be willing to do, have a good suspicion. And, when I give a mediator proposal, generally, ideally, I want to have a, 90%, belief that the case is going to settle, for the number that I'm proposing. I never know 100%. I've never done a proposal where I'm like, yeah, I know exactly both sides are going to say yes, but I do have, as I said, a very strong, likelihood it's going to happen. If it's dead on arrival, if I know that, I'll tell the parties, we're not going to do that. We're going to look for some other solution. Gene, is there times when mediator proposal is not the best option?
Yeah, sure. Well, there's a few different times where it's not the best option. First, if the factors that Matt just went through are not met, if you haven't done the robust negotiations, et cetera. Next is if it's too early. This should not be used as a shortcut to fully negotiating and for getting the mediator everything they need to help evaluate the case. So for young practitioners, one tip would be, avoid the temptation to shortcut. Hey, can you just tell me what you think? We might offer where we think it can go, but for the mediator's proposal, which is really the last step, I'd say go through all the steps first. Another time I would not use mediation proposal if we know there's a missing chair, either from the pre-mediation discussions or otherwise. And finally, if there's a funding problem, such as we know from the private discussions, and that's where those breakouts are helpful, that the insurer does not have enough authority to do it at that time, or they're waiting to find out if another insurance company is coming on board. Under all those circumstances, I would not do a mediation proposal. I would say, though, Matt, when we do them, they're extremely successful, super high success rate. And in that vein, why should we trust a mediator on his or her proposal?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify one thing. Typically, when we do these mediator proposals, they're what we call double-blind proposals. In other words, each side is going to tell the mediator privately either yes, they accept the proposal, or no, they don't accept the proposal. That's an important part of the proposal, the process, because the mediator gets 2 yeses, then we know we have a settled case. If the mediator gets 1 yes and 1 no, the other party doesn't get to know what the other side said on the proposal. So both parties are protected in that way. So in other words, if you say no, you don't know whether the other party said yes or not, because you don't get to hear that. You just know that the case didn't settle. Now, as far as trusting the mediator, I mean, I think this is kind of where the rubber meets the road for everything. The parties have selected the mediator, hopefully, that is experienced, who has good success record in these types of cases, and for me, that's construction cases, and has spent the time, as I do, to really get to know the case. And so, importantly, every mediator proposal I've done is always done in writing. It's always including an analysis. I mean, it's not a 10-page brief, but it includes the briefs, the arguments, the information I've heard from the parties, from the experts, the settlement offers that have gone back and forth, and it includes a risk analysis. So all those things go into the proposal that hopefully when the parties get it, they say, yeah, I can see where you're coming from. I can see, the strengths and weaknesses, and, on balance, it's better to resolve the case and settle for a number that I'm not quite thrilled about, but a neutral party has weighed in and said that's a good number, and that's why it's so successful. It's used in that way. Gene, what about you? Why trust the mediator?
Well, I'm going to give a simpler answer. These mediators' proposals work. It's extremely high success rate, and part of that is because a good mediator has gone through all the steps we've discussed. They've gathered the information pre-mediation, during mediation, breakout sessions. Some of it confidential and some of it has been shared, but when you bring it all together, it's extremely helpful to hear from a neutral third party. And sometimes that's just what the parties need to close the gap. So the parties have stalled out on their back and forth negotiations, and they frequently come to the neutral saying, hey, where can this end up? And that's where we might be called upon to make a mediator's proposal. Again, I agree with Matt. Don't do it unless it's got a high probability of success, because it's usually the end game. And under those circumstances, we found them to be highly effective and almost always successful. I think we're just about, we're past a little out of time. So I saw there's some things in the chat, Kanita.
Yes, there are a couple of questions. The first one is, have you had any success with getting a carrier or carriers to pay and chase when there is a carrier on the risk that's not participating?
Ooh, that's an issue near and dear to my heart, Matt. I'll take that one. This was a lot of my prior career. Yes, but boy, it's an uphill battle. The fund and chase is not the mentality of most of the carriers. There are some out there, I'm not going to name names today, but there are some out there that have dedicated subro or contribution departments, and so they will do the fund and chase. I do agree that most of them are reluctant to do that, even though they have an obligation to get their insured out of harm's way. They understand that, but they're hoping that they can be done and close their file. Matt, anything else to add on that one?
Well, I mean, this was your bread and butter, so that's, a great answer. But, I've had zero success. I mean, they never want to ever do it. They want, in fact, they want a global resolution that includes a 1540 release. And, the mantra is, I'm paying money so that I will never hear about this case ever, ever, ever again.
Yeah, that 1540 release Matt's referring to is a California thing, but yeah, they want to close their files is the short answer to that question. But I have had success on occasion, even in the last few years. It's rare, though. I would agree with whoever asked the question. That's extremely rare.
And do you believe that you should not bracket if the middle of the bracket is higher than you would pay? Are you essentially promising that you'd pay the middle amount?
No, I think that's important, and that's a common belief. So, generally, I tell the parties, each offer stands on its own, and it doesn't mean that you're going to the middle of anything. And that's why I always tell the parties in negotiating, I think you can put your best foot forward with your offer or your response, and then you can temper your next response with what the other parties say. So the bracketing, in my mind, is just an acknowledgement of really what is the reasonable range of settlement. And you're not agreeing that you're going to the middle range at all. And that's sometimes where bracketing, gets hung up a little bit, is parties are reluctant to say, hey, I'm not agreeing to pay, in the middle of this. But the other side of it is if you're clearly outside of the range of settlement, we're just kind of treading water. We're not really getting there. And I've had several cases, one comes to mind recently where the parties just kept asking me for a mediator proposal. And I kept saying, no, we're not in the range of settlement. And so finally that case ended up where each parties gave 998 offers that were higher than anything they ever offered, during mediation. And then once that happened, I said, well, now actually I can probably step in and do a mediator's proposal if you guys are still open to it. And that case ended up finally resolving based on that proposal.
Okay, I think, are there any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. Thank you, guys. This is very helpful. I've used mediator proposals too, rarely, but I have two questions. One is because, as I think Robbie pointed out in the chat, a lot of people don't really know about this. So do you ever talk about it up front at the beginning of the mediation? I do not, but you're making me wonder whether maybe I should.
I don't, and it's for the reason that I mentioned before. I really want the parties to try to fully resolve the case. And if the case is not resolving, there's usually reasons why that is. And so I think the mediator, frankly, needs to diagnose that. I just heard a story recently about a complaint about mediators who kind of in between mediation sessions sit back and kind of wait for the parties to come forward. And I think that's just a wrong approach, because in my mind, the whole point of the mediator is to figure out why is the case not settling and try to get there. So I'm going to work as hard as I can to get the parties to the point to settle on their own. And if they can't, then I introduce the concept. But I don't like talking about it at the beginning, I guess.
Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah. All right. Second question. As a practical matter, Gene mentioned that he does this with a pretty carefully prepared written document. So does that now put you into the next day? Is that what normally happens when you all do this?
Wow, that's a great question.
I do. I'm sorry, Gene. I typically tell the parties, I'm going to present this to you in the next day or two, because I want it to be thoughtful. I'm just not going to give a knee-jerk response, and I want it to be received by the parties with due consideration.
Yeah, but let me just add that, because your question is an excellent question, and I know you do this too, right? That sometimes the parties are so close, they just need the mediator's proposal to close that gap, and then it can be a same-day deal. But I just had one where both parties were completely hung up on principle. All I heard in their room, and you probably heard the same thing, was well, we stand on principle. We'll pay what's owed, and not a penny more. Well, we're not going to take a penny. And so I actually took that head on and wrote a paragraph in my mediation proposal about how I respect companies standing on principle, but that I don't think standing on principle is inconsistent with making a good business decision. And so that's the way I would address that. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, I think that's very
I
well
really-
said.
Okay.
I really like that, Gene, and I just want to say that I think that's why you put it in writing, because you really can hit head on the issues the parties are most concerned about.
Thank you, guys.
Okay, that puts us at the 12:30 mark. So we have to close out for now. But it's great having you. Thank you so much, Jean and Matthew. And thank you for everyone that attended. Have a nice holiday.
Happy holidays. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you,
Good
everybody.
seeing everyone.
See you all in the new year.